Hello everyone, this is Craddock, and today we'll be going into some discussion into some theory crafting on the Talvir Manald Heal Archon Lightning Hydra Wizard. And in particular we'll be putting a focus on Bane of the Stricken, the legendary gem, and how we might be able to use that gem to our advantage when it comes to group builds in particular. Now, first we're going to go over attack speed in general and how it relates to Stricken stacking. After that, we're going to go into some comparison builds. All of them are Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac based. I haven't gotten to COE yet, but we'll be looking at optimal gear affixes, and skill choices for those builds. And then after that, we're going to take a look at the spreadsheets and all the math and the formulas behind everything that gives us some data, and it's going to tell us whether Stricken stacking is worth gearing for with this Archon Wizard. And after that, we're going to go into discussion on I'm going to talk about some real game applications and how. So first, let's talk about attack speed and how it relates to Stricken stacking. There are a lot of spells in the wizard's arsenal, and they have different speed coefficients. Speed coefficient of 1 would mean that you hit only once per attack. Speed coefficient of, say, 3, which is higher than 1, means you would hit 3 times per attack. At an attack speed of 5, with speed coefficient 1, you'd hit 5 times per second. With an attack speed of 5, you'd hit 15 times per second with a speed coefficient of 3. Now, these are mostly channeling spells, so the ticks are spread out as evenly as possible throughout the duration. Examples of Speed Co 3 would be your Disintegration Wave, Arcane Torrent, Ray of Frost, Disintegrate, that sort of spell. Speed coefficient of 1 would be like your Arcane Punch, or I forget the name of that, but like Magic Missile, Shock Pulse. A lot of your signature spells are Speed Co 1. So Bane of the Stricken is a proc-based mechanic. It's the type of proc that can occur on the hit ability, and it ignores proc coefficients, which would limit the chance of it proccing. So it's not limited in that way, but the spell or ability that you're using to proc Bane of the Stricken must have a proc coefficient higher than 0, so it has to be able to proc in some way. And they're limited to once per attack, so this basically means that your first enemy hit will have Bane of the Stricken attempted to be applied on it for that attack. This is why in a group setting on the Rift Guardian often mobs will be pulled away by the supports so as to let the single target DPS down the Rift Guardian faster. So let's bring it back. Now, Diablo calculates or tracks stacking debuffs and this sort of thing in a unit known as frames. There are 60 frames each second, which means that each frame is basically the smallest any calculation can be done. The Stricken, Bane of the Stricken, has an internal cooldown, and this applies in a 1 over attacks per second fashion. This is basically done to make sure that your speed coefficient equals 3 spell is applying Stricken in a similar fashion that your speed coefficient equals 1 spell would be. It means that you wouldn't be able to apply Stricken any faster using a spell that has a different speed coefficient. They're basically going to come out almost the same due to how it is applying this internal cooldown in the formula. Now, to make it even more complicated, Blizzard put in what's known as an ICD scaler. This is a variable that they can use to tweak the result of the formula. And it's set independent for different skills and different abilities. A basic formula would look like this. If your ICD scaler was 1, you would divide 60 frames, 5 attacks per second, and you would round it up. to make sure that it's a whole frame, and you would get 12 frames. So the lowest ICD achievable with an ICD scaler of 1 is 12 frames at 5 attacks per second. But the ICD scaler, surprise, for Bane Stricken is actually 0.9. So here's our formula, and you can look over it if you want. I've already put a chart here on the left side of this spreadsheet, and it lists your, I guess, attacks per second, your attack speed on the left column, and then here's the number of frames between stricken stacks, or the, I guess, the ICD formula, if you want to call it that. But it's plugged in, and every 100th of a difference in attack speed, I've dragged this down, and you can clearly see when you do this the breakpoints in attack speed. As I drag this down, 4.5, here's like 4.16, I guess, 3.86, you know, so there are definite breakpoints that we're going to be looking for when we're going in and looking at these builds. Now that we have that fresh in mind, we understand that high attack speed will get us a lot when it comes to stricken stacking. We can go ahead and look at some of the builds or test builds that I've put together for this Theorycraft. And as a base, I took the Trade Secrets group. Zanji, Troopster, and Bear have done a great job testing on the PTR so far with these sort of Talvir Archon Hydra builds. And so I wanted to have a base for when I'm going through this particular build. I don't mean to bash their ideas. Their ideas are great. I'm just trying to find a better way to build the same thing, so to speak. So let's see if together we can improve this build and make it better. So the first thing I noticed with this build is it is very low attack speed. Hydra, similar to Bane of the Stricken, has breakpoints, and I believe for Lightning Hydra, one of those breakpoints is 4 attacks per second. So having only this much attack speed when you're in double stack swami would be fairly limiting. Basically, your Hydra will be attacking 25% less, since it goes from 3.33 down to 2.5 attacks per second. Both of your Hydras will be attacking less. That just translates to less paralysis procs, less Manald heal damage, and snowballs into something worse. So you definitely want to hit that breakpoint, I would think. So even they had the right idea, definitely, with putting the Lukuni Prowlers in. I think that's a great choice for all of these builds. But not having the additional attack speed will probably bring it down a little bit. So that's one of the main things I'll be trying to improve upon. Second point, this build, the skill configuration, kind of along the same lines, doesn't look as optimal to me. I mean, yes, Spell Steal is a great damage multiplier. It's a good thing to have for helping you clear the rift, alongside Teleport even. That's really nice defensive boost, but since we're going to need all the attack speed we can get, I'm going to say slow time, stretch time is going to be a very valuable pick, especially for these Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac builds, because if you don't know it, how the stretch time, slow time works with your normal spell and your Archon spell is your Archon assumes the room of your normal spell, so it will benefit. Your slow time when you put it up in your Archon form will benefit from the 10% IAS. But if you plop your normal spell down on the ground before entering Archon, you double dip. You can get 10% from the normal spell and an additional 10% from the Archon slow time bubble. So this is something you're going to want to take advantage of. And I think I've got a little clip I'll show to you here. So So here we're at our base attack speed. You can see I don't have any Archon stack modifier type equipment on my character. We boost up from 2.07 to 2.22 when we're in our normal slow time. Now I go into Archon. The additional stack bumped me up another 10% from my Archon slow time by standing in the normal slow time above what I already had. So that's just... So what did I do to get to a more optimal sort of setup than what they had put together? And what I came up with in the end was something like this. Similar to that setup, it's still a ranged setup, so we still have Serpent Sparker, but you'll notice my attacks per second is a lot higher, and the thing about the slow time, stretch time, the double stack effect, it doesn't show on your character sheet, especially on D3 Planner here, it won't show. So this is actually 4.29 attacks per second maximum, this build here, once you stand in the slow time and you put up your Archon slow time. So it's very specific sort of setup you have to get that working, but this I think will be very good. Note, I rerolled the amulet from cooldown to attack speed. I kept the attack speed on the ring like they did. I kept the Lukuni Prowlers. We've got our chest, we've got our weapon, we've got our obsidian ring. I also put an additional roll here, so that's at least 2 additional rolls of attack speed in this build than were in their build. And these are quad gloves. They might be harder to get, but they're going to be well worth it in my opinion. So something to keep your eyes open for when you're farming next season. And I would do something similar to this sort of configuration for a ranged Zodiac setup, where you use either Black Hole Spellsteal, or you could swap this out for Calamity, and that would be your option for a mobility rather than this. Note also with this build we're running Ray of Frost, Cold Blood, both to help manage resource and to optimally configure our skill choices. I wanted to keep Force Armor because it's such a defensive boon, but something you could test around is swapping this out instead and running Arcane Torrent, but this I think will be a better setup all around. Note, because I've got the reduced resource, I opted for the Tal Helm and I just wore the Fazulas, get that extra Vite. Typical range setup, you know, you've got the Starfire, Zaze, Power Hungry combination, and yeah. So the next type of build or variation I wanted to test is the idea that maybe with the higher attack speed we could stack Stricken faster and therefore kill the boss or RG or clear faster. So I first did a ranged Zodiac setup with the Pig Sticker, which has a higher base attack speed. It is 1.5 instead of 1.4, which you would get with a wand. So this dagger can help you hit those higher breakpoints that we might need for Stricken stacking. And that's the basic idea. We swap out the Starfire, we lose that multiplicative bonus, but we keep the Zaze and the Power Hungry for a ranged setup. And it's a very similar build, pretty much almost the same skills. The big difference here is you get an attack speed bump. This says 4.45, but it's actually somewhere in the range of 4.6 once you're standing in both of those slow times. So that is a lot of attack speed, and you can imagine just how fast you're attacking with that sort of setup. And our last and one of our final setups was a melee lightning Zodiac Archon that stacks Stricken with the Archon Punch. So this was a very interesting idea. I wanted to test and see if it was even viable or if it's just a ridiculous thought. But the difference here is instead of using the beam, we use our Archon Punch. Same setup though with the Pig Sticker, the high attack speed at 4.6 attacks per second, you know, same attack speed rolls on gloves and amulet rings and every place basically you can roll it. And yeah, so this is the fourth setup that we're going to be testing. There is an alternate setup that I thought up where you drop the Lightning Archon and instead you run with cold or cold on your bracers, which would mean when you're in Archon you're dealing cold damage. This would be a more specialized setup to where your main role would be just be the RG. You're an RG killer, you're not going to kill any trash because you're going to do solo damage on the trash. You wouldn't even be comparable, I would think, to anything. So, but the idea is basically you drop the Ray of Frost, you pick up Arcane Torrent, so when you're out of your Archon cycle, you get a few extra procs through Static Discharge. And I don't know, I think it would work well as well, but we'll have to see if that's really an optimal thing to do. It might be kind of boring to play. So here we are back on our spreadsheet. Let's move over to our attack speed formula calculation where I've done all the theory crafting on. So it's a lot to look at first, but what we're going to focus on is the start from where we just saw all the builds. So I went over all the builds. They each have different attack speeds, and those are reflected here in this chart. This is the Trade Secrets setup. Here's the ranged Zodiac with the wand. Here's the ranged Zodiac with the pick sticker, dagger. And here's the melee Zodiac with the dagger. You can see in double stack swami, here are the attack speeds, and it scales up fairly nicely once you get the 1.5 attack speed weapon. I had to account for slow time, so that's why this row is here. Just here's your second row that you probably want to be looking at, is when you're outside of double stack swami and you only have one swami, you will typically only have one of your slow time stacks. So I had to account for one of them, the one you put down on the ground will disappear, and by the time you get to single stack swami you will not have that benefit. So that single stack of slow time is not included in these values here. These are reduced by that 10% attack speed. So before getting any further, there are several assumptions that are factored into the test results here, or when I'm calculating multipliers and all of that. We assume a stationary Rift Guardian, no Oculus, random Oculus procs, we're not factoring that in. We account for a level 100 Stricken in our calculations, which is 1.8% damage per Stricken stack, and we assume perfect conditions for any skills or items that are range-based required, so Zays, Power Hungry, Audacity. We just assume that you're at the maximum benefit for those items and skills. We assume consistent Archon cycles when comparing multiple Archon cycles, so I assume 5 seconds outside Archon. I figure with all the spells you're going to have to cast anyway, it might take about that long, and that's just a guess, but for the purposes of this test, it is consistent. And I also assume 16,000 int on the hero when it comes to multiplying in intellect differences for getting a multiplier, I guess, adjustment. And we also assume that your Hydra breakpoint adjustment, if you go up in a Hydra breakpoint, or down conversely, I assume that that attack speed bump increase or decrease translates into Hydra damage. So I've included it in the Hydra damage column as a multiplier. That's just something to note. One more, I forgot. There are also, I only put here the damage modifiers and multipliers that were different in between all the builds. Since the builds are very similar, they're all Talvir based, I did not have to put in every little multiplier such as Audacity or Power Hungry. Those things are the same in all the builds, whether they are ranged or melee. So now that we've got all of that out of the way, we can get on to what are you looking at first of all. At the top here, you've got basically an attack speed calculation for a character slot. It's similar to what D3 Planner would show, except I can manually manipulate the values here. I can set it to whatever I want, and I instantly see what attack speed it would result in. So this is very handy for me when I'm doing these calculations and tests. And the only really interesting thing to note is most things are multiplied together, and then they come out with some sort of character APS, but your weapon, its base attack speed, and the roll that goes on that weapon is a separate multiplier of some sort. So this is separate from all these attack speed rolls. Just keep that in mind if you intend to, I don't know, take a look at this, download it, play with it, whatever. So, and over here you can see our Hydra breakpoints. I've already put in a handy dandy logical formula to figure that out based on the chart, which is really neat. And yeah, there you go. So now let's get back on task. What are we looking for? We're looking for Stricken stacking with the Talvir MH Zodiac setups. So what I did first was I went through, and we all know, or most of us who have played Wizard a lot, know that the Archon Beam doesn't stack Stricken quite as fast as the Archon Punch, and I wanted to figure out where and when that occurs, and how we can do, what we can do to optimize it. First, to figure that out, I had to plot it out on a sort of little graph for each build that we have talked about. So for each build I've plotted this out, and what it's going to do is figure out how many frames are being wasted by having to channel your disintegration wave instead of using the Archon Punch. So our first build we're going to be looking at was the Trade Secret setup, which had the lower attack speed. And I've copied the number of frames for double swami and single swami down from the top of this sheet. They're also listed up here in the attack speed chart, so that's something to keep an eye on. And you'll notice, across, lower attack speed 15, 18, 13, 16, 12, 15, 12, 15. So these obviously will be stacking Stricken faster, but how much faster is the question. So on our Trade Secrets setup, we have almost 3.8 attacks per second in double stack swami. The ICD is 15 frames. So when you plot this out, you figure out that, it's actually a 16 frame cycle, and it's wasting 1 frame per ICD cycle, I guess you could say, in double stack swami. And this puts us at 3.75 Stricken stacks per second, which is, I don't know, I guess it's a moderate amount. And same here, we did the analysis for the single stack swami, and it's wasting even more. It's wasting 2 frames per cycle, and the cycle increased from 16 to 20. You can tell. So Stricken stacks per second lowered to 3. So how am I getting this Stricken stacks per second? I'm simply dividing the number of frames per expected cycle, including the wasted frames, into 60 seconds, and that gives me my stacks per second. So let's go ahead and look at the next setup. This was the high attack speed setup with the wand, the Serpent Sparker wand that I had put together, and it is sitting at 13 in double stack swami, which is a bit higher than the 15 that we were at before, which surprisingly doesn't make a lot of impact. We're still in a 16 frame cycle, basically this plot, I forgot to mention, what it's saying is that the green X is where a stricken proc occurred, and then the red X's are where your spell is ticking. So it's attempting to deal damage and would be attempting to apply stricken, but it can't because the ICD is active. So that's how we get these differences, and I figure out, the frames in which, or I guess the frame cycles, you could call it, and the stricken stacks per second that for each build. Now, this particular build, getting back to it, at 4.3, double stack swami is 13 frames, doesn't get you much. It's still a 16 frame cycle, which still puts you at 3.575 stricken stacks per second for the Archon beam. So this is where we're beginning to see, even at a higher attack speed, our stricken is not stacking faster because the beam is wasting so many more frames, I guess just from having to wait between the ICD resetting and your next tick of damage. And we look down here, single stack swami 3.4 surprisingly is at the same number of frames per second as double stack, so at least it's consistent. I guess that's a good thing. So let's scroll on down and take a look at the ranged Zodiac setup. This is the one with the 1.5 attack speed dagger, the pig sticker, that still uses the beam. And this setup did a lot better. Because of the increased attack speed, we were able to get a lower ICD stricken breakpoint. So it went down from, what was this? From 13 to 12, and that actually made a huge difference because we were no longer wasting any frames in between our procs when using the beam. So the cycle here, the number of frames between procs, reduced from 16 to 12 when we're in double stack swami, which is a big help. It means you can stack up to 5 stacks of stricken per second, which is a lot of stricken stacks. And when you're in double stack swami, single stack, it's back down to 3.75, but what do you expect, This is very interesting to me, as I never expected it would be able to line up this perfectly, I guess. Yeah. And finally, down below, we have our Melee Zodiac setup, which is it was a lot easier to calculate because it doesn't have wasted frames when you're using the speed coefficient of 1. All you have to do is divide it. You get the number of frames from your attack speed using the formula that we talked about before, the Stricken formula, and then we simply divide that to get our number of stricken stacks per second. Double stack swami for the Melee Zodiac was 5 stricken stacks per second, 4 stricken stacks per second in single stack swami. Something interesting I wanted to calculate was the theoretical drop due to you losing attack speed for some reason. Say if you were to lose your Gogok stacks, or happen to be standing outside of your slow time, things like that would drop you down a breakpoint for whatever reason. Something to note is that the Melee Zodiac setup fares a lot better than the ranged Zodiac setup when things go wrong, because a drop down to 13 frames still gets it 4.6 stricken stacks per second, whereas with the range setup you go right down from 5 all the way down to 3.75. It's a huge drop, and you're really going to miss it if things go wrong. So that's just something to keep in mind. So now that we know all of these values for these various test builds, how do we use them to get relevant data? So what I've done is I copied the number of stricken stacks per second, and I've plotted them in a graph here or in our attack speed chart, actually. It's the two double stack swami is right here. We've got single stack swami in this row, and then we've also got our time when we're outside Archon, which would only really vary if you're using, I guess, a melee setup from your single stack swami. So you can actually see that on the melee setup right there. And I have used these numbers, these stricken stack per second numbers, to build another chart, another sort of data chart to let us know how many, when, and how many stricken stacks are applied over the duration of a theoretical fight with, say, a Rift Guardian. So this is what this graph is doing below. Note that it's charted in seconds, and it relates to the Archon cycle. So you'll see sets of, I'll say rotation, that means one Archon cycle. You were in double stack for 15 seconds, and then 5 and 5. You were in single stack, and then outside of Archon, resetting Archon. So that's what you want to look for in this graph, or look at. So what are we plotting in this chart? We're plotting the number of stricken stacks or procs over the duration. And you can see here, I've just plugged in the numbers from the first set, and then I've carried those over. And basically what it's looking at is it's multiplying the time difference. So in this case, we were in double stack swami for 15 seconds, and we were applying 3.75 stricken stacks per second, which gives us a total of 56 stricken stacks for this slot of time. And this is carried over all the way, and obviously they will be pretty much the same for each cycle. So this isn't really what we want to look at. What we want to look at are the totals and the differences from those totals. So I've carried these down. What I did is, in addition to the, I guess, just the number per cycle, you also have the total here. So we're summing in this section of the chart the number that we had and we're adding it from the previous cycle, we're adding it up. So at this point in time, in this cycle, we had 71 stricken procs for this build, and it goes on and on and on. That's the idea with this section of the chart. The next section, we're looking at the differences, and we take the differences between one set of one build in particular. We used the Melee Hydra build since that was the highest attack speed build, and it's the one that we're wanting to compare against. I compared the differences from every other build to this build, and those are plugged into the... And this section here at the bottom is the key, because this will tell us if a certain build is worth going for. Now, before we can do that, we have to know. So here are our 4 builds, and I've plotted out the multipliers as they relate to one another. We've got our trapped, which would only be in the melee setup. There's a weapon modifier, so daggers roll a lower weapon damage range than the wands do, so we have to make up for that in some way or account for that. And what I figured out is when you add in both the source, the offhand that the wizard uses, and the main weapon, and you come up with averages. I took the average damage, and you compare those average damages between the dagger and the wand. The wand had 10.5 or about 10.5% higher, so that's what this weapon modifier is here. As mentioned before, the Hydra damage, since I didn't realize that the attack speed was off for this build until after I had initially put this together, the Hydra attack speed is accounted for as a negative 25% modifier in Hydra damage. We have Starfire, Zays. We adjust for intellect with the Trade Secrets build because it included intellect on the gloves, and it was the only build that did that. So, like I said before, 16,000 intellect base gives you about 6%. And then we put our multiplier, we basically multiplied all these together and got a final percentage. And then we calculated the percentage differences based off of, again, our melee setup. About the Hydra, Hydra benefits from attack speed multiple ways. There's the aforementioned attack rate, which they bump up an attack speed breakpoint and they attack faster. And the Hydra also gains damage from increased attack speed. Now the damage gain is a snapshot mechanic, meaning that the Hydra is only increased in damage from the point at which they were cast. So that means since you will pretty much always be casting them when you're only in single stack swami, the damage increase might not be quite as high as you would think. But it's still a damage increase nonetheless, and as you can see here, for our 1.5 attack speed builds, it's almost 20% damage gained just from that alone, which is really nice. So we can see here our trade secret setup is about 50% multiplier damage higher than our melee setup. The 1.4 attack speed with the Starfire was actually 142%, which is a huge amount. And then our range setup with the pick sticker is only about 18% higher damage. So now we can use these values to calculate expected break-even points on our chart of time, to where the setups that use lower multipliers but have higher stricken stacking mechanisms or attack speed figure. So to plot these on our time graph, I basically took the difference in power between the builds and divided it out by the stricken stack amount, and then that gave me a number of stricken stacks that need to be met before that build will break even. And you can also see double damage, triple damage, quadruple damage after that. Remember, I'm using the melee setup as a base, so all the comparisons are with that build. Our ranged trade secrets setup build was only 50%, so our break even is about 29 stacks. That puts us at about right in here, so a little bit after 30 or 35 seconds you will break even with the damage of that setup using the melee setup, and pretty much everything after that is icing on the cake. You will double damage at about 50-55 seconds, I'd say. So almost a minute you'll double that damage of that build, and you'll triple the damage, later on. You get to 100 seconds, and then down the line, like 3.5 minutes almost, you get quadruple damage. So you can tell this build, the Trade Secrets build, is not optimized for stricken stacks. Even if it has high multipliers with the Starfire, it's still missing the attack speed from the Hydra, and that is what's really dragging it down. But we have other builds to compare to, so let's continue. The higher attack speed with the Serpent Sparker build fared a lot better, and is actually one of the main data points that I'm going to use, because this build took about a minute and a half before the Rift Guardian you would break even with a Melee Hydra with Pick Sticker. So what that tells me is it's going to take quite a while to even break even, and the multiplier of that setup is already pretty damn high. So this will definitely be a contender. Looks like 3 minutes in, a little bit after 3 minutes in, you finally will double your damage over that setup. And then finally, the 1.5 attack speed range setup is better than the melee setup. Remember, this is a base for the melee setup, so this is actually is the converse. It's, you know, gonna take the melee longer to catch up to this build, and quite a while. Like, even though the multiplier here is a tad higher, it's still gonna take. That's gonna cause it to take quite a while because the differences are very low in between these two builds. The attack speeds are very similar. What does this really mean then for your character in game and the builds you're going to be putting together? The results here show several things that are quite notable. Is that the pig sticker is actually a viable choice when you're going for high stricken stacking builds. It fared very well in giving a huge bump to stricken stacks and allows it to overtake the other builds which have huge multipliers after a fair bit of time, because the setup with high attack speed and the Serpent Sparker is so powerful. It did take quite a while to overtake that setup, and that's one of the main reasons that such a build with a pig sticker to stack Stricken faster would probably only be used for the highest of pushes if you're opting for a Zodiac setup. And the reason being is what's showed here is just the Rift Guardian fight. You have to think of usefulness in the Rift as well. How useful is your hero to the group as a whole for the entire Rift? And as a single target DPS, if you're not at least putting out some level of damage, you become less useful than classes or other builds that could do that. So when we're comparing these multipliers, these have a larger weight for clearing the rift than the other builds that don't have that high of a multiplier would. Something to consider. Based on this data, it would take a minute and a half to make up the damage that 1.4 attack speed Serpent Sparker Starfire setup, the damage that would be able to put out. That means that sort of setup would be much more useful for speed setup, because if you're killing the Rift Guardian in less than, I would say, even less than 2.5 minutes, it's still more beneficial to run that instead of a pig sticker. I'd say once you get into 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes range with that build, you should think about maybe trying to run a higher stricken sort of setup. It really depends on how much you think. But I would think if you're having trouble killing a Rift Guardian in 3 to 4 minutes, having Stricken there to stack faster would be more beneficial. Now, as to which setup is better between the two for stacking Stricken, obviously they're stacking Stricken at the same rate for the double stack swami, so they're fairly comparable when it comes to that. But the thing you're going to have to consider is, even with this power increase, I think it's much easier to stack on the boss and get these close range damage bonuses than maintain a full 50-yard Zay's bonus, which would, even if you're 10 yards down, basically makes up the difference between these two builds. So that's something to consider there. Another thing with the ranged Stricken build is it's kind of imperfect when it comes to breakpoints, because even one little slip, as I was saying earlier, one little slip in your attack speed, and pew, you go right down from 5 to 3.75 stricken stacks per second, which severely reduces the utility of such a build, and the entire point is to maintain that. And by that I mean, if you drop like one attack speed roll, if you would have to have both swami stacks. See, if I lose one of these, I am no longer in above 4.5 attacks per second, which we already showed, is a breakpoint for Stricken stacking, and this is the one that improved the beam, I guess, internal cooldown stack rate. So that's a huge hit. So if you lose one slow time, if you lose some Gogok stacks, I mean, any of these could happen in a fight, and it's just much more severe if you were to run a ranged pick sticker setup. So in my mind, that's not the best way to go. If you are going with a pick sticker, I would stick with the melee setup. And again, the reason for that is because Stricken, if something happens similar and you lose your Gogok stacks, you again are only reduced from 5 to 4.6 instead of 5 to 3.75. So it's a much smaller hit to your Stricken stacking rate. So you would definitely want to be at the highest attack speed you could be for the melee build just to maintain that breakpoint. But for the range setup that showed the highest multiplier that still had decent Stricken stacking, this would do very well for speed farming. You could theoretically drop some attack speed, or we want, I'll show you that real quick. So base we have at our max rolls, which is what I've set up on the build, you have 4.29 attacks per second, or attack speed, and you have wiggle room because Stricken is the same whether you drop down quite a bit in attack speed. It won't make much of a difference if you do. The only thing is you will lose some Hydra damage, and you will lose sort of the utility, what I would say is the utility of the build if you decide to drop attack speed rolls, because here, look here, assuming we only have one stretch time, and assuming we drop our attack speed, that puts us just above the 4 attacks per second, which I was saying was necessary to maintain your Hydra attack speed. And now, what do we gain by that? We gain 1,000 intellect, maybe a ring roll instead, so you'd keep the attack speed on the amulet, and you, on your ring you could roll average damage range or cooldown, something like that. That would increase your base damage instead of the attack speed. The reason I'm not including both stretch times in this calculation is for a speed build, you're kind of moving around a lot more. It's not as perfect. It's imperfect. You want it to be as easy as possible. You don't want to have to do fiddly little things like having to pop both your slow times on top of you. So that's why I'm not including that when I'm going to say, you know, hey, I can just, you know, keep this and take 2 rolls off and then roll a lot of damage. No, that's not how it works in the real game. So that's why we're down a slow time. On that note, with the extra slow time, you could do something like, since it is a range setup, you could set up a way and pop the slow time on the group that's closer to the Rift Guard. My preference probably would be just to roll the max attack speed here anyway. That's just me, but I'm just letting you know, for that build you could probably get away with 1 lost attack speed roll if everything else is rolled correctly. And having that flexibility, I mean, if you got imperfect rolls here, the ability to still hit the minimum breakpoint even if you don't have perfect rolls, that's another plus for the speed farming setup. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at that. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you're actually playing these Zodiac builds, there is a certain cast order that is required, especially if you're using spell steal, and also with the slow time, you have to cast them in a certain order to benefit most from the Hydra and damage in general. The order would basically be, since spell steal is also a snapshot mechanic, you want to cast that before the Hydra. Same thing with the slow time. It doesn't matter what order you cast these 2 in, just so as they are before the Hydra. That way the Hydra gets buffed by both of these, and then you go into Archon, thereby increasing the attack speed of the Hydra. And you can also get the extra attack speed from your Archon slow time as well. In summary, I will probably be running a few of these builds. The first one being the speed farming setup with high attack speed rolls, as high as you can go on gear, just to make it easy to get those speed runs in. The interesting thing with this sort of build, since you're still running the lightning element on your bracers, you're still dealing damage both with your beam Monolithial procs and your Hydra Monolithial procs. The thing though is, based on a different video which I will link, I tested and they conflict, at least on single target. When the Hydra is proccing, it will take precedence, or that seems to be what is happening, over the disintegration beam. Now, if this is happening on a larger scale, as far as when you're talking about density, then you might want to think about maybe not placing your Hydra for one rotation, clearing out the trash, and then when it gets lower density, place your Hydra. They finish off the elite, and then your group can move on to kill other things. Anyway, that's just, I will be interested to test that out when the season comes, or on PTR, in fact, if I can get anybody out there. The other setup I will be looking at is the Melee Zodiac setup for high pushes. I'll still be looking for a nice pick sticker to see if this is any better, and hopefully my clan will enjoy seeing a funky build. They won't just throw me out. Anyway, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this little theory crafting session, and I hope it has helped you in deciding what skills to use, what rolls you need on gear, all those good things when it comes to building your Hydra Wizard in Season 10.